Clearly, I want to lose friends, or I wouldn't be making this video. I have largely refrained from engaging in the discourse around whether or not those of us on the left, and by the left I mean socialists, anarchists, communists, or more broadly speaking, anti-capitalists, should or should not vote for Joe Biden, should or should not advocate for him, and what form, if any, that advocacy should take. I did this because from what I've seen, this discussion is at best unhelpful, and at worst, toxic. In my experience, the conversations tend to be people arguing past each other and treating the people they disagree with as though they are an amalgamation of all the people they've had similar disagreements with, and framing opposition to their own position as the least defensible version of itself. You're either a rad lib who thinks that Joe Biden and the Democrats can be bullied into making the party socialist, or you're some anarchy Bernier buster who wants a Trump second term because you think it will hasten the revolution. You know, Twitter discourse. These caricatures don't exist. I mean, they do, but they are a minority and largely unimportant, and you're probably not even arguing with them. The whole of left Twitter isn't enough to even slightly swing this election, and arguing with these people, be they straw people or not, and those who get lumped in with them, is pretty much just a waste of everyone's time. That doesn't mean that I think that advocating for your beliefs is in and of itself a waste of time. If I thought that, I wouldn't be making this video, or any video for that matter. I call it a waste of time because it almost certainly won't affect the election, and it definitely won't further the cause of moving past capitalism. What I want to do here is separate the wheat from the chaff, as it were. I want to present the arguments I think are good, explain why I think the bad arguments are bad. I'd also like to explain why some people might refuse to vote for Joe Biden, and why berating people for their positions, whether for or against, is ineffective. I'm going to play the radical centrist here, because people on both sides of this issue have good or bad points, and people on both sides both use rhetoric that overcomplicates the issue. The truth is very simple. Joe Biden sucks, and you should vote for him. I won't be going into detail about why Joe Biden sucks. By now, we are all aware that he's an accused rapist, he authored the '94 crime bill, and he, a known conservative member of the party, was made Obama's running mate to help assure the old white racists that the black guy speaking passionately about change wouldn't be too radical, and boy howdy did that promise deliver. We've all heard this before, and we don't need to hash out the details. The fact of the matter is that Biden is not the guy anyone actually wanted to be in this position. To prove my point, I challenge you to find a single Biden 2020 sign or bumper sticker, because I've seen a grand total of 1. And I have seen hundreds of Keep America Great stickers, and I live in the suburbs of one of the bluest states in the country. So, I won't be going into detail about why people feel, at best, ambivalent about Biden, but I will, however, be going into detail about why you should vote for him. Are you ready? Here are the reasons to vote for Joe Biden. Number 1, Joe Biden isn't a fascist. That's it. That's it. That's the one good reason to vote for Biden. There aren't any other reasons. But given that Donald Trump is a fascist, or if we want to be charitable to the fuckwad for some reason, is at least seen by fascists as a figurehead for their movement, we actually don't need any other reasons. This one is good enough. Go vote for Joe Biden, you fucking nerds. Now, there are valid reasons why people are refusing to support him, vote for him, advocate for him, and may show apathy or even disgust with his candidacy, and we will discuss those. But those things aside, a Biden victory in November is, at least in the context of the next 4 years, absolutely the preferable of the 2 possible outcomes. To go further into this, let's get into Section 1. Arguments people have about this subject on YouTube and Twitter that are really just them talking past each other instead of engaging with what the other person is actually saying. This statement, while not without merit, may sound absurd, and the people who phrase it this way are often trying to make the arguments of others sound absurd. From what I've seen, this argument comes in two basic flavors. The first is from an internationalist position, those who view the parties through this lens, especially those who live outside the US. No matter which party is in power, the structures of American empire still exist. The trade deals, the coups, the World Bank, the IMF, the military bases, the drone strikes, and so many other things do not change every 4 to 8 years. And what does change will just be changed back if the other party doesn't like it. This is an important perspective, since those of us in the US lack this perspective. And as leftists, our enemy is the system itself, not one dude. And even if people stating this frustrates our attempts to have a president who isn't a fascist, we need to keep in mind that who is at the head of global capitalism won't fundamentally change how global capitalism functions. The second is from a more materialist perspective. At their core, the Republicans and Democrats both represent the interests of the ruling class in their economics and feign representing working class interests through various social issues, identity politics, culture war bullshit. Neither party would dare lift a finger to help working class people if lifting that finger would threaten ruling class power in any way. Something that, really needs to happen. And this is 100% true. Where I take issue with this being used to assert that voting for Democrats is pointless is that it presumes that all that identity politics / culture war stuff is the same. And it's not. If we were to separate the social from the economic, and I know it's impossible, but bear with me, one party pays lip service to issues faced by women, people of color, and LGBTQ folks, and will occasionally, begrudgingly, back efforts to make society a more equal place. Occasionally. While the other party is the primary vehicle for the growing fascist movement here in the US, and they don't have to occasionally begrudgingly back efforts to make society a more unequal place. Inequality is how capitalism functions, and white supremacy has been used to justify that inequality since before capitalism was a thing. It's not a bug, it's a feature. So while the culture war bullshit of one party may be feckless and often cringy, the culture war bullshit of the other party is actually dangerous. So while their differences may be narrow, they are very important to the well-being of a lot of people. And this is why when people say things along the lines of the parties are basically the same, people might come at them a little hot. Broadly speaking, the Republicans and Democrats aren't fundamentally different, but their differences do matter, at least domestically. It's not that people who conflate the two are wrong, it's that in the context of the presidential election, this rhetoric can seem unhelpful and even counterproductive. The reason people often argue past each other on this particular topic is because, much like cancel culture, when people talk of electoralism, they are using different definitions. For some, engaging in electoralism means voting at all. For some, it means spending our political energy advocating for a candidate. And for others, it means treating bourgeois democracy as though it can be a vehicle for meaningful change, bring about the glorious workers' utopia, or forego the need for an actual revolution. And I'm sure there are many other takes on this that fall outside of these. Personally, I favor the latter definition and lean towards the second, but that's not really important to what I'm trying to say. My point here is that the next time you think someone on Twitter said we shouldn't bother voting at all, maybe take a moment to entertain the idea that you may have just interpreted what they said that way, and it wasn't actually what they meant. And not that there aren't people floating around social media who threw up their hands and decided to play video games and sit this one out after Bernie got rat-fucked a second time. They exist, and they're super annoying. But also bear in mind that you don't know everyone's offline praxis, because if they're smart, they aren't making that shit public. Remember that the point of specifically not engaging in electoralism is to instead engage in more useful action, and that could be exactly what @SexGuillotine1312 is doing in their community. Okay, so it was a short list. I'm sure if I thought really hard, I could come up with other things about this subject that people keep arguing past each other about, but I think I've made my point. The people are not the caricatures that our minds and social media make them out to be. And if you must engage in this discourse, then maybe take a little time to figure out where your actual and potential comrades are coming from. Okay. Now I have to talk about the bearded ponytailed elephant in the room. So it is, of course, impossible to talk about online left discourse around Joe Biden without talking about Vaush. It is also impossible to talk about Vaush in a YouTube video without throwing out the disclaimer that this is not an attempt to call out or cancel Vaush or comment on the effectiveness of his work or its overall value to online left discourse. While I do agree with him on some things and disagree with him on others, I just want to talk about a few things he said and their implications without making a whole thing of it. I have a number of disagreements with Vaush. Most of them rhetorical, some of them ideological. However, when it comes to this issue of Joe Biden, I 100% agree with him that a Biden presidency is very much preferable to 4 more years of Donald Trump. However, Vaush has taken to making some bad arguments to advocate for this. Like I said earlier, there is only one good reason to vote for Biden, and it's so good, no other arguments need to be made. Donald Trump is a fascist and Joe Biden isn't might not convince everyone, even if you do refrain from using the F word, but it's all we have, and resorting to arguments with more holes in them than Tony Montana isn't helping. More importantly, I constantly hear people uncritically repeating these arguments, or flipping the argument on its head to use it for the opposing position, which means that while I'm talking about Vaush in this section, Vaush, and even his fandom, aren't what I'm trying to criticize. The arguments are. Too bad it's a lie. Sure, some of this stuff might happen, but we all know that even if it does, it'll be the least meaningful, bare minimum shit possible. Unironically holding up the platform as a reason to support Biden and the Democrats is like saying that politicians always lie unless they wrote it down. Unless a major structural shakeup to the party has occurred, something that the Dems have been fighting tooth and nail to prevent, platforms are meaningless if they contradict the party's record. While the platform has shifted over the last 5 years, the Democrats themselves have not, and continue to live in a fantasy land where things don't fundamentally have to change. So you'll forgive me if I, and dare say most working class people, are inclined to call bullshit on the lot of it. You know this one. Vaush did a whole video about it. I will not go into how Vaush took the quotes he used out of context, how he quote mined for evidence to support his conclusions rather than testing his assertions, or how he possibly didn't actually read the things he claimed to. Sexizzy, Bad Empanada, and Hakeem did great videos picking apart Vaush's claims on the subject. I would especially recommend Hakeem's video. It is very, very good. My take on the question of would Marx vote for Biden is who fucking cares? Not only have all these guys been dead for a century plus, but even they would tell you that their work is not meant to be taken as gospel. It is to be considered, and where possible, applied to the conditions unique to our own time and place. Whether or not Marx advocated for voting for X party in the German elections of 18 whatever is totally irrelevant, because the material conditions of that time and place are completely different from our own. And don't for 1 second think I'm letting the Lenin-opposed working with bourgeois parties so don't vote for Biden people off the hook, because not only is it not a good reason not to vote because it's the same shit argument, it's painfully non-strategic thinking. Whether you are using this argument to try to convince people to vote for Biden or to stay home, you are not only making a blind appeal to authority, you're doing a bad job of it. This argument is technically correct, but I wouldn't say that this is a productive use of political energy or anything to hitch your wagon to. Not only is this an insanely low bar, since we'll never get anything out of the Republicans, but the Dems, as I've said before, will only concede the least meaningful, bare minimum shit. But again, it is technically correct. There were times in the past that the Democrats were receptive to pressure from their voter base, and with a sympathetic person in power, there is an opportunity to restructure the party and get actual harm reduction. The problem I have with this line of thinking is that it presumes that this is still a feasible plan even though Bernie Sanders lost the primary, because this was the plan for a Sanders presidency. Once we had a sympathetic person in the White House and at the head of the Democratic Party, we could then engage in activism that, while it wouldn't come remotely close to ending capitalism, could secure gains for the working class. Biden is not that guy. The Democrats are not that party right now and haven't been for 50 years. This argument, while technically correct, is practically speaking untrue. Honestly, even if your goals are noble and I agree with them, resorting to these shitty arguments does no good for your cause, since they can be so easily refuted by those who oppose you, and at best it's simply reinforcing the beliefs of the already converted. And I find that disappointing because despite my issues with Vosh, I agree with him on this, and I know he's capable of making better arguments than these. But I think overall, my point in this section is that Vosh is too much of a coward to ever debate me, for if he ever did, I would crush the walnut that is his brain within the superior vice-like nutcracker jaws of my incredible intellect. Debate me! Debate me! There are, I believe, a few good reasons to specifically not vote for Biden. Some of them are personal, and some of them are structural, but all of them are valid, in my opinion. When I say voter suppression, I'm not talking about the sort of hard voter suppression you might be thinking about. I'm not referring to the closing down of polling places, the instituting of voter ID laws, or the fact that the disenfranchisement of felons is still legal. Rather, I'm talking about the cumulative effect that these measures have, combined with rhetoric that you get from South Park liberals, the turd sandwich and giant douche argument. Sure, you get similar arguments on the left, but like I said earlier, these come from a very different perspective than the nothing will ever change anyway centrists. I don't think it's right to blame people for all these things having an effect on them. If it takes you hours of waiting in line to get an ID that you will literally only use for voting, and then hours upon hours of waiting in line since your state doesn't just mail everyone ballots like mine does to vote for Joe Biden, and you've been drip-fed propaganda telling you that voting doesn't matter, then I can see why you would feel like you have better things to do with your time, such as feed your family, or just feed yourself since you can't afford to have a family. None of us are immune to propaganda, basically. This one could have gone under voter suppression since, well, that's what it is. But I made it separate because it's the reason I'm not voting for Joe Biden. I know, I'm a huge hypocrite for not voting for Biden, but asking you to. But hear me out. I think my reasoning is pretty solid. For those who don't know how it works, the American people do not choose the president, the Electoral College does. Each state gets a number of electors based on the population, and the minimum number is 3, which means that there are states that should get 2 or 1, but get 3, meaning that the individual votes of people in low population states matter more than the votes of people in high population states. This is essentially how someone can lose the popular vote, but win the presidency. In the vast majority of states, the electors are all awarded to the winner of the popular vote in that state. This creates states that are solidly blue for Democrats and solidly red for Republicans, while only a handful of purple or swing states exist whose votes actually get to decide the election. It is such a profoundly ridiculous system that, as far as I know, no one has replicated it, and in all the nation building the US has done, we haven't even imposed it on anyone else. I live in Washington State, not DC, and it is one of the bluest states in the country. The last time Washington's electors voted for a Republican was in 1984, when basically everyone voted for Reagan for some reason. Joe Biden is going to win Washington State. Now, this puts me and many others in a shitty situation. I don't want Joe Biden to be president, but I prefer him to Trump, since my vote for all intents and purposes will go to Joe Biden, who I put on the ballot is completely symbolic. I may as well write in Bernie Sanders, or vote for Vermin Supreme, and god damn it, I just might do either one of those things. But I have a hard time stomaching voting for Biden, and I don't have to, because I'm essentially voting for him no matter what. And to be clear, I live in a state that Hillary Clinton won by 16 points. If you live in a state that Hillary Clinton won by 5 points, do not kid yourself. Trump could win that state, and it would be irresponsible for you to just assume that Trump will lose in a post-2016 world. There is, of course, a very slim possibility that Trump will come within spitting distance of winning my state. But if that does happen, then he will certainly already have his victory sealed in almost every other state. So, it still won't matter how I vote for president. Okay, now that I'm done making excuses for myself, let's get into more serious reasons people might have. The 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, the Senate version of which was, in part, authored by Joe Biden, made federal law the infamous three strikes policy, incentivized states to dole out more frequent and harsher punishments, and, most importantly, signaled a political shift that led to this era of mass incarceration. That signal being that the expansion of the carceral state was a bipartisan position, which not only implicates Biden, but the whole of the Democratic Party. And Biden has been strange about responding to this part of his legacy. He's both defended it and expressed regret over its results, which to me pretty clearly demonstrates that what he is doing is not taking a position on the issue, but trying to give whatever answer is politically expedient. Super gross, but boilerplate politician stuff. But since this wishy-washiness muddies the waters on what his views on the incredibly topical issues of mass incarceration and over-policing are, and indicates that he'll simply go with the political flow on this, it makes it very iffy to know where he'll land on this, and his VP pick isn't exactly reassuring, and we have his actual record on this, which is not good. Look, if, for example, you have a relative who was put away for life for some pretty minor shit, and this guy is the one who wrote the damn bill that did it, maybe you can't stomach voting for him into the highest office in the land, and I think that's fair. This one is much like the last one. It deals with personal trauma, with systemic roots, and Joe Biden has a known history of being involved with it. Biden has, of course, been accused of rape, but even if he hadn't, we've all seen image after image after image of Biden invading the space of and engaging in obviously unwelcome contact with women and girls who are uncomfortably young. This is absolutely indicative of a mentality that devalues the autonomy and personhood of women. Not that I'm necessarily claiming that he believes all women belong in the kitchen making him a sandwich. I don't know his mind, and this is a systemic issue that's certainly not unique to him anyway. And before anyone says it, fuck whatever earlier time he came from, I don't care. Perhaps the worst part of this is that looking back on the Obama years when the public became super aware of this behavior from Biden, I remember The Daily Show and other late night shows doing bits on this and laughing it off like he was just being some lovable, quirky goof. The people who know what this feels like had to watch for 8 years as we all had a chuckle at the vice president sexually harassing countless people he came into contact with. Frankly, shame on all of us. And yes, Trump has been accused of and been publicly shown to be personally just as bad on this, if not much, much worse, but that's really beside the point. Now, when it comes to this reason to not vote for Biden and the one before it, I am fortunately not among the people who have suffered in this way. So if you'll bear with me as I speak for what I understand to be the experience of others, the reason why I find these explanations to be extremely valid is because asking these people to vote for this man is, in a certain sense, asking them to relive their trauma. Again. And this is what I find so, frankly, angering about comments, even those made offhand, saying that anyone who doesn't vote for Biden is an idiot, or doesn't care about trans people, or brown people, or whatever. You don't know who your words may reach, and in painting with such a broad brush, you inevitably shame people for their own trauma. Like I said a few months back, the things you say have consequences. Perhaps not for you, but for the most marginalized among us. As I write this, it is extremely unclear how voting is actually going to work this year. Several states other than mine also do all mail-in voting, and most do mail-in voting by request. And while there is a lot of talk about rolling out mail-in voting nationwide, each state decides how they vote, and much of the actual voting could still take place in person this November, despite the Rona. And if your state requires you to show up in person, denies you an absentee ballot, and you have a high risk of catching and dying of the Rona, then shit. Fair enough. I think that in all likelihood, the pandemic will have two effects. Those who will be likely to sit this one out will definitely sit this one out, and no matter who wins, a lot of people aren't going to believe the results, which is not a first for the US, but it is concerning all the same. But all in all, I'd say not wanting to die is a pretty good reason. Ask yourself this. What are your political goals? Why do you fight the fights that you fight? Why do you advocate for the things that you advocate for? What change do you want to see in the world? If I may speak for the entire left, what we want is the defeat of fascism, the end of capitalism, and the establishment of a society where power is distributed as evenly as humanly possible. What I see as the heart of this disagreement, and I could be way off, it's not a divide between radlibs and anarchities, but a disagreement between those who view primarily this rising fascist movement as a barrier to ending capitalism, something that has to be dealt with before we can start building a better future, and so that's how we should be organizing and spending our energy. And those who view fascism as primarily the result of the alienation and instability of capitalism. And so, therefore, it can't really be dealt with until we start to deal with the economic system and present a viable alternative to it. And so that's how we should be organizing and spending our energy. Both of these positions are right in their own way, and I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail about it, but I think there's really some synthesis that can be found here. But in my experience, it is the latter outlook that causes people to take the attitude that no matter who wins the US presidency, our goals aren't actually being furthered, even if those people concede that Biden is the better of the two outcomes for reasons that are outside of our top political goals. While the former outlook tends to lead people to view the removal of Donald Trump from the presidency as of great importance, something that really does further our top political goals, even if only marginally. I can sympathize with both of these positions, but I don't think the end of the Trump presidency is going to do anything, really, to fight fascism. Regardless of the outcome of the 2020 election, Donald Trump, Steve King, the alt-right, the Boogaloo Boys, they're not going anywhere. And on November 4th, they'll either be bolder or they'll be angrier. And neither outcome is good. A Biden presidency will temporarily deny them those specific levers of power, but whether or not it will even slightly slow them down remains to be seen. So when it comes to what I see as our ultimate political goals, this specific election isn't going to make a whole lot of difference, and because of that, arguing about it back and forth is truly a waste of everyone's time. There are just better uses of the limited time and energy we have to fight for the future we need to create. I didn't choose the title of this video willy-nilly. Yes, I do hope it's obvious similarity to the title of Ben Burgess's new book, which I have no opinion about because it's not out yet. We'll get it more clicks, but most importantly, I chose it because the world is actually burning. This is the view from my front porch, which is usually awesome, but right now, not so much. Down there, and barely visible, is the city of Tacoma, currently weeping not just because Vosh is off Tinder, but because it's shrouded in smoke from wildfires that knocked out power for hundreds of thousands of people in the area for days and caused the grocery stores, including the one I work at, to throw away millions of dollars worth of food. And this fire isn't even that bad. Frankly, I'm fine. I just have to drive around the fires to get to work. Across the mountains, eastern Washington has it much, much worse, and so do Oregon and California. And right here, we have a serious on-the-ground issue that Joe Biden and the return to normal politics he represents won't solve. Like I said before, Joe Biden is not that guy. Arguing about him while the world burns feels, at least to me, like a waste of time. However, that does not mean that voting is altogether pointless. So I've talked about what I think are understandable reasons to not vote for Joe Biden, but even if you won't or can't, I would implore you all the same to try and to vote regardless. 2020 will not be the year we established the glorious workers' utopia, and Biden and the Democrats are not the vehicle for us to achieve that anyway. But look, I'm going to be honest with you. The thought of a second Trump term where he doesn't have to worry about re-election scares the shit out of me. Those camps scare the shit out of me. And they should scare the shit out of any socialist, communist, or anarchist. Political dissidents always end up in the camps. Always. Will Biden close them? Personally, I'm skeptical. Obama is the one who started them after all. But even if Biden closes one concentration camp, it is one concentration camp less. And look, Biden aside, there are other more important, more local things that are going to be on that ballot. Things that affect you a hell of a lot more than who the U.S. president is that, you should be educated on and you should be involved in. The first election I was old enough to vote in was 2004. Something I've been getting flashbacks to for some reason. And basically every 4 years since then, I've been told that this election is the most important election of our lives and the fate of America hangs in the balance. And there are only so many times you can hear that before you just start fucking ignoring it. But in a way, it's kind of true every time. The Republican Party is arguably the most dangerous organization maybe ever. And they should be denied power whenever and wherever they seek it, even if the only alternative is a bunch of feckless liberals who are only slightly less bad. This and other reasons are why I've never bought into the "we just shouldn't vote at all" arguments, even from those who acknowledge that it's not totally useless, but it is still like a waste of our political energy. Because frankly, it doesn't take that much energy. I mentioned earlier voter suppression methods, and there are many others that I didn't mention. That make it difficult or impossible to vote. But setting that aside, if those don't really burden you or don't apply to you, then, taking one day out of the year to fill out a ballot is really not that big of an ask. And regardless of whether or not you do vote, and especially if you actively don't, you need to be organizing locally, not here. This is not the place to do that. Join a reading group, participate in your union, find an affinity group that you can trust and get involved in these protests. Join a communist party. Find a queer anarchist collective that meets in your area. And if you can't find any of these groups, take the plunge. Start your own. You might actually be surprised how many people were just waiting for an organization to join. But even all those more useful and important things aside, I implore you. I know this guy sucks, but please vote for him. The alternative, the only alternative, is actually dangerous. So stay safe, stay radical, and remember, Orange Man indeed bad. Cheers. Thank you to my patrons, especially Questing Refuge and Monkey Revolution. The next video might not come out for a while. My output is probably going to slow down a little bit, unfortunately, because I have just taken on a lot more responsibility in my job, and I have joined a couple of D&D campaigns because D&D is my version of grilling, and like everybody else, I just want to grill. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one, and hopefully it won't be too far in the future.